The socio-political order of Roman civilization, especially from the late Republic on, was predicated upon mass-scale slave labor. In peninsular Italy, free farmers who eked out a living on modest plots of land became fewer and fewer as the elite, especially Roman senators and equestrians, used years with bad harvest to gobble up small estates while using their wealth and connections to dominate Rome's public land. This threatened the security of the countryside, undermined Roman military recruitment, and contributed to urban crowding and discontent. If peninsular Italy was careening toward a crisis by the mid-130s, then Sicily was already there. The grandees of Sicily operated large plantations which produced much of the grain which kept Rome the city fed. Slavery always had an obvious potential for cruelty to compound exploitation, and this potential came to fruition on Sicily. A sufficiently large number of slaves on Sicily came to find their lives intolerable, and so they embarked on a desperate bid for freedom in 135 BCE. The Romans brutally stamped this revolt out, but then followed this up by failing to recognize the causes of their recent woes, allowing slave discontent to fester once again. By 104, Sicily's slaves were up in arms again. In both cases, we see some of the worst traits of the late Republic on full display. A slowness to comprehend the gravity of the situation led to a bumbling response, followed by a brutal solution once the problem had grown far greater than it should have. In the wake of both the First and Second Servile Wars, the Romans failed to ask uncomfortable questions about why the revolts had occurred, and so failed to take any proactive measures which might prevent the problem from recurring yet again. This pattern of thought and behavior, or perhaps one could say this pattern of a lack of thought and continuing bad behavior, also applies to Roman politics in general after 133, and ultimately killed the Republic. Prior to the Roman conquest of Sicily, which began in the 260s, the island had been home to both a large number of Greek and Punic settlers. It was well populated, prosperous, and a center of culture. However, the Romans didn't really see Sicily as a place which had a great deal of potential in its own right, but rather saw it as a place where they could grow grain to take to Rome. Due to agricultural patterns shifting in Italy proper, they saw Sicily as a place which could produce grain in bulk and send it north. And therefore large latifundia or plantations emerged, and the local grandees were very much encouraged to focus on grain to offset the fact that most of the large estates in Italy were now focusing on cash crops, such as grapes for wine or olive oil. So this had the effect of making sure that Sicily was important to Rome, but because it only produced one resource, it tended to be a bit overlooked. And so governors who went to Sicily could get away with quite a bit, and their main job was to back up the local landowners who were pretty exploitative and greedy in their own right. Because of this pattern, Diodorus Siculus tells us that conditions for slaves on Sicily were worse than in most of the rest of the Roman world, and conditions for slaves in Rome in general were not great. Now, there were some slaves who were treated relatively well if, say, they had a special skill or they developed some sort of close relationship with their master. But for the most part, most slaves had not that great of a chance of achieving freedom, and because they lacked a specialized skill, their owners would treat them fairly poorly. In Sicily, where they had production schedules and where none of the slaves were all that specialized, the masters were especially cruel. And so this really will fuel a lot of discontent. We also have to keep in mind the overall context, not just is there a lot of discontent among the slaves, but also because the Romans have enabled the landowners of Sicily to amass large estates outside of the cities, there are very few armed free men living in the countryside. So if there are small-scale revolts, local free men won't get together in militias and deal with them. As for the local militias on Sicily, which do exist, they're not of the highest quality. Most of them are non-Roman, and because they are now under the aegis of Rome, they don't really take training all that seriously, so if they are called out, these are very much third-rate formations. Another problem is that there are armed men in rural Sicily, but they will not be siding with the Roman authorities. These are the pastores, slaves who are effectively herders, but do a little bit more than herd goats and fend off the occasional wolf. These slaves are fairly well armed, and they often engage in banditry, both on their own accord, and sometimes even at the connivance of their masters, who will order their pastores to harass the pastores of other large landowners. And when Roman officials investigate, the owners will largely cover up the crimes of their own pastores, since of course they are the ones behind those crimes in the first place. So, effectively, the only men who have any significant military experience or some equivalent thereof are armed slaves. You can see how this is going to pan out. The conditions for a slave revolt, therefore, were ideal, but it will always take some event to really trigger something like this, and in 135, that trigger point was reached. So this year, according to Diodorus Siculus, there was a wealthy landowner named Damophilus who lived near the city of Enna. He and his wife Megallis were noted for their excessive cruelty, which apparently stood out even among the notoriously cruel slave masters of Sicily. What started out as a basic murder plot by their slaves then developed into a full-blown revolt, as it not only overtook Damophilus' estate, but then spread to neighboring estates. Eventually, the undertaking received an official blessing from a holy man and miracle worker who said that the gods were behind this movement, and his name was Eunus was the man who gave his blessing to the slave revolt. He was a well-known slave on the island who was said to be able to predict the future, and apparently had some sort of a trick he could do to make fire come out of his mouth. That's actually a fairly common trick for guys who claim to be miracle workers or holy men, so that is fairly plausible. When the revolt grew and began to overrun the area around the city of Enna, the rebels, who had overrun most of the estates on the outskirts of town, decided to gather together in the local theater to get organized. They knew that some military response was inevitable, and they also began to figure out that they could potentially spread beyond the city of Enna. It was at this point that they met together and decided to choose a king. Eunus was chosen for this role because he was thought to have something like the blessing of the gods and to possess some sort of strategic vision. Eunus was from Syria, meaning that he had grown up as a young man as a part of the Seleucid Empire. Most likely he was not Greek, but he had been a subject of the Seleucids and had at least some passing familiarity with that empire's political culture. And because of that, he decided to take the name Antiochus, so he became King Antiochus. And then he declared his female consort. Slaves could not officially be married, but many of them did have long-term partners. So his consort became his queen, and then his chief advisors, the other guys who were prominent in this revolt, were appointed as royal officials. Under the leadership of the newly minted King Antiochus, the revolt continued to grow. Slaves flocked to Eunus's banner, and he was ultimately able to gather somewhere in the neighborhood of between 20 and 200,000 men. Again, the numbers are not entirely clear, and a lot of that is because Diodorus Siculus is usually not the best source when it comes to those kind of details, and again, we're relying on him, so keep that in mind. The point is, though, that under Eunus, the slave revolt does manage to gather a sizable number of men on its side, and that this will require a fairly large-scale response from the Roman governor. The revolt of the self-proclaimed King Antiochus was not able to spread directly by means of the slaves under his command. Rather, it sort of sparked independently as rumors arrived of a slave revolt elsewhere in Sicily, so then local slaves joined in on their own accord. The slave revolt in the city of Agrigentum was led by a slave named Cleon. So he's the one who persuaded his fellow slaves to rise up with him to overthrow the local authorities and join in this general revolt. Cleon did have the foresight, however, to decide to align himself with Eunus and the other slaves at Enna rather than trying to go his own way. And the reason this was a significant decision is that otherwise the Romans would be able to use divide and conquer tactics more readily. So, much to the annoyance of the Romans, who probably assumed that each of these slave leaders would want to go his own way and set up his own independent kingdom, Cleon decided to just apply to Eunus to become a general, and that is the arrangement that they had. Exactly how closely they worked together is not entirely clear, but it appears that they never had any serious friction as far as we can tell, and this contributed to the rebellion lasting a little longer. Despite the overrun of 2 major cities in Sicily, the Romans were not terribly alarmed, and they very much underestimated the ability of the slaves to maintain the revolt. Eunus and his general Cleon were able to win victories by utilizing their superior numbers against the inadequate numbers of Romans that were sent against them. Another thing to keep in mind is that when the slave forces would win battles, they would then have the ability to acquire more armor and weapons from their defeated foes, meaning that their army would always grow stronger with every battle that they managed to win. For the Romans, they continued to send slightly larger forces incrementally, and they had trouble finding an adequate commander. If we look at the names of the men that they sent, they were not sending necessarily the most obscure men in Rome. There were some noble names on the list of men who were sent to Sicily and ultimately were humiliated by mostly Cleon's generalship. So, for a few years, Sicily was starting to become a quagmire, where Romans went to be humiliated. And then in 132, finally, the Romans decided to send a consular army under the plebeian consul Publius Rupilius. Rupilius was something of a new man who was fairly well liked, and he would manage to maintain his popularity by succeeding in Sicily where so many had failed. Not only did he get his consular army, but they also sent a half-sized army under a propraetor named Marcus Perperna. So effectively, the Romans were almost at full capacity when it came to putting down this revolt, and it turns out that the forces that they finally contributed in the war's 4th year were enough to put the revolt down before the year was out, or maybe slightly afterwards. Rupilius managed to capture the city of Enna, he managed to track down Eunus, and also proceeded to mop up all of the various pockets of resistance in coordination with Perperna. By the way, if Rupilius had stayed back in Rome, he would have been involved in the trials of some of Tiberius Gracchus's friends, which no doubt would have led to him being prosecuted by Gaius Gracchus the way that his patrician colleague was. So really, Publius Rupilius lucked out massively that he got sent to Sicily. At first, he might have thought that this would really be a stain on his reputation given what had happened to his predecessors, but in reality, not only was he able to win a great victory for Rome, but also managed to avoid getting himself entangled in the Tiberius Gracchus drama. So, talk about some luck for Rupilius. The Senate seems to have been overjoyed with the success of Rupilius and his colleague Perperna. Rupilius earned a triumph, which is the highest honor that a Roman can receive for a victory over a foreign foe, and Perperna got an ovation, which is the second highest honor that one can receive. So, the Senate rewarded both of these men pretty lavishly. So the question becomes, well, what did they do in the aftermath of the First Servile War? Rupilius' settlement even has a name, and it's called the Lex Rupilia. Scholars for quite some time used to believe that this was a piece of rather profound legislation which really tried to come up with some clever solution for the problem of slave revolts in Sicily. However, it would appear that Rupilius' idea was that the slaves who had revolted should be replaced with new slaves. So rather than having a bunch of slaves who had been taken as a group from Syria and shared a common language in Greek, they would instead take a bunch of slaves from somewhere else, who also shared a language that was probably something other than Greek, and that would apparently solve the problem. You could go back to all the same old abuses, and everything would be just fine. So after the war, Rupilius and subsequent governors would go look for prisoners of war who were being captured on other fronts and buy them in large numbers to restock the plantations of Sicily. Or I should say, rather, that these men allowed this to be done by the landowners. So a lot of men arrived as groups who had pre-existing ties to one another. They were then spread about Sicily, and they replaced all of the many dead from the First Servile War. Rome figured that after having killed so many slaves, that the new slaves would be cowed by what had happened, but what they didn't count on was not only did the new slaves also have a sense of community amongst themselves from their free days, but also the memory of this mass slaughter of slaves was short-lived because not that many of the old slaves were around to tell the new slaves about it. So the intimidation factor simply wasn't there, and the same social networks which helped to allow the First Servile War were there, and all the material conditions which really made life intolerable were there. So effectively, if this was Rupilius' solution, it was incredibly simplistic, short-sighted, and, well, I think we can say with hindsight, completely and totally ineffectual. In 104, just 28 years after the suppression of the last slave revolt, the conditions were ripe for another slave revolt. However, there always needs to be a spark, even when the kindling is there and the weather has been dry for a while. And this spark came at a place called Helicii near Lilybaeum. Helicii was a close ally of Rome, and it did not have to pay tribute, which was an honor that Rome granted to very few other communities on Sicily. This means that every governor who visited could be reasonably expected to be friendly toward Helicii, regardless of his attitude toward any other place. And accordingly, governors could be expected to respond quickly to any problems that emerged at Helicii. In 104, slaves revolted and quickly gained control of the city, and so the governor came in like a thunderbolt in order to put this down as quickly as possible. The rest of Sicily watched with bated breath, waiting to see what would happen. The governor in this case was smart enough to realize that the easiest way to undermine any revolt is by taking it down from the inside. So he went to some convicts and basically offered them a kind of plea bargain of sorts, where effectively in exchange for serving him to undermine this revolt, the individual in question would receive a pardon for all of his many crimes. The individual accepted this, managed to get into Helicii, gain the trust of some of the other leaders, become one of the leaders himself, and then effectively open the gates to Roman vengeance. Whether this man escaped in order to enjoy his pardon, I don't know, but I suspect there's a decent enough chance that he was killed in the storm of the city. At any rate, despite the swift response by the governor, the rest of Sicily was not cowed by this because conditions were just that awful, and because, well, let's face it, whenever you concentrate an entire Roman force at one point, this means that it will take a while to extricate it from there to get somewhere else. So if you're a slave on the other side of Sicily, and you know that all the Romans are concentrated on the west coast, well, guess what? That's an opportunity. And there was another factor at play here, too. A lot of the slaves had had high hopes until just a moment before. The reason why so many Sicilian slaves were ready to fight for freedom is precisely because they felt that they had been promised this in a way, or at least a good number of them did. Back in Rome, the Senate had actually passed a law which called for the manumission of all slaves who were citizens of Rome's allies, meaning that if you had been born as a free person and you were a former citizen of some power that was now allied with Rome, you would be freed. Or at least that was the understanding among the slaves of Sicily. And so, there were plenty of people around who had high hopes of being freed in the near future and possibly leaving Sicily and going back to their homelands. Some of them even thought that this would apply further and that Rome was ending slavery in its provinces. Now that is a very optimistic read of the situation and probably completely unjustified, Yet this was something that was spreading about. Rumors that can promote hope are just as likely to spread as rumors that promote doom. So the slaves were pretty hopeful at this point, and even people who did not come from Roman allies thought that perhaps this law might help them. However, both groups were wrong about who this law would help, because the governor, the same man who had just dashed the revolt over at Helicii, was very much in the pocket of the grandees of the island, the large landowners, and so as they, in their panic, approached him to make sure that he would not enforce this law, he made it clear in a public proclamation that there would be no mass manumission, so this law would not end up really taking effect in Sicily. After all, Sicily was Rome's breadbasket, so perhaps he could argue that there were special circumstances involved or some other way to weasel his way out of this. He also could probably predict that based on the way that law usually worked at Rome, this is probably about to get rescinded by the Roman equivalent of these same grandees. So when the slaves heard this, and they heard that all of their hopes had been in vain, and that manumission was not coming, another mass-scale slave revolt broke out, more or less spontaneously across the island in 104. Given the relative recency of Rome's experience dealing with a large-scale slave revolt on Sicily, you might think that it is rather surprising that their response was so inadequate and even anemic. However, if we think about the larger context, it becomes clear why the Romans were not better organized and better able to respond as they should have from the beginning. If the Romans were aware of what was going on in the slave camp, they would have known that the two chief leaders, Salvius and Athenion, were not as talented, frankly, as Eunus and Cleon, and also not nearly as willing to cooperate with one another. So it does not appear that either of them had the charisma of someone like Eunus or the generalship of Cleon. So perhaps the Romans were correct to analyze that they had enough time to prepare and to put this on the back burner for a minute. At the time, Rome was distracted by what they saw as a far greater threat in the north. The Cimbrian Teutones, which were both Celtic or Gallic tribes, were in the north of Italy, and they had defeated a major Roman army at the Battle of Arausio just a couple years before. At this time, Gaius Marius was holding back-to-back consulships, reorganizing the Roman legions, moving away from the manipular legion and toward the cohort legions, the professional legions that would be so characteristic of Rome in both the late Republic and in the imperial period as well. So the Roman military is kind of in flux at the moment as the entire system of its organization is changing. That's a big factor. And what forces are available are being hurried to Gaius Marius in the north in preparation for a decisive showdown with the Cimbrian Teutones. Meanwhile, the pro-praetor Lucullus has a fairly modest army under his command in the second year of the war. He's making some progress, but he was ultimately unable to finish the war because Rome decided to recall him and send out his replacement. He wasn't necessarily recalled, it's just that his term of office expired, and it was normal in Rome up until a little after this for commanders to only serve for 1 year. So Lucullus felt that he had been betrayed in some way, and so rather than hand over his command and go home without making a stink, he instead tried to sabotage his successor's ability to wage war by burning a lot of his supplies before he left camp. So later on, his political enemies managed to prosecute him over this, and he was convicted on charges of embezzlement and then sent into exile. So Roman internal political competition very much impeded their ability to win this war, because if Lucullus's army had remained intact, then his successor could have finished the job and things would have ended right there. As it was, it would take just a little longer, and this would enable the revolt under Salvius and Athenion to regain a bit of momentum. But overall, it's worth noting, this revolt was not as serious as the first one. It was not as well organized or led, and Rome was able to afford the luxury of waiting and biding their time while they dealt with the more serious threat in the north. In 101, as the war was entering its fourth year, the Romans decided to return to the 132 playbook and send a full consular army. This time the consul in command was Manlius Aquilius. His force was not only a full consular army, but one which contained several cohorts that were on loan from Gaius Marius, who had just wrapped up his campaign in northern Italy. So this force did have some elite units in it, and it would appear that none of the slaves under Athenion and his colleague had any real shot against Aquilius' army in a pitched battle. However, despite having a vastly superior force, it took Aquilius until the end of the year 100 to bring the war to a close. He then earned an ovation for his efforts. It's unclear exactly why he got an ovation rather than a triumph, but typically speaking, to win a triumph, you were expected to slay a minimum of 5,000 enemies in the field, so either Aquilius was not able to meet that threshold, or else he was not as popular in the Senate as he needed to be to get full credit. The war, despite apparently a fairly low body count in terms of men slain in action, did considerable damage to agriculture in Sicily, not just because of the time that slaves spent in revolt. Aquilius had to actually provide grain for some of the Sicilian cities after the war was won, and a lot of these cities had typically been exporting grain. So this means that either there was a really bad harvest or otherwise there was just enough damage done to the local countryside that not enough grain was grown, and even the fairly modest populations of a lot of these Sicilian cities could not be sustained without grain from elsewhere. As for the fate of the captured rebels, rather than being put to death en masse as they were in the first Servile War, the Romans chose to use many of the captives of the second Servile War as performers in what are called animal shows at Rome. Animal shows are where people are literally sent out to fight bears, lions, and other large predatory animals, and then get mauled and torn apart for the amusement of crowds. Speaking of that trend, at this time this was becoming more prominent in Rome, this idea of these brutal public entertainments, whether these are gladiators fighting each other or people trying desperately to fight wild animals. This was becoming a normative feature in a lot of Roman celebrations. And there's no way that, say, the rampant cruelty toward captives and toward people who are made to fight each other, there's no way that that would then feed into this pre-existing problem of discontent among slaves. Nah, that's crazy talk. There's no way this will ever be a problem, or that this problem will come directly to Italy rather than being contained in Sicily. Everything will be fine. Except that it wasn't. 30 years after the Second Servile War ended, the Third Servile War broke out, this time in Italy itself. The war actually started in Campania, one of the favorite districts of Roman senators, where they often had their biggest and most luxurious estate on the Bay of Naples. There were some portions of southern Italy, which coincidentally had also seen very heavy Greek settlement, where there were pastores wandering about, comparable to those in Sicily. So these were often men who were slaves, but bore arms and would fight one another. These men had seemingly sided with Hannibal back in the Second Punic War, and not surprisingly would then go out and fight alongside of Spartacus and Crixus and the other leaders of the Third Servile War. When it really came down to it, while conditions for agricultural slaves were a little better than in Sicily, they weren't that much better in Italy, so plenty of farm slaves were willing to join in. Oh, and by the way, the main component of the Third Servile War, and the reason why it's the most famous of these revolts, is that Rome had really gone full bore into its gladiator obsession, and so there were gladiator schools in many Italian cities that weren't that far away from Rome. These schools were full of armed slaves who were being trained for action day and night. Many of these men were former soldiers in their home countries. They had then been captured and taken to Rome, so a lot of them had a pre-existing identity and experience fighting in more than just stylized duels. Once a slave revolt broke out at the city of Capua, the Roman response was sluggish and inadequate. The conflict was prolonged. because of the sluggish and inadequate response, most of Rome's best armies were far afield. And then an army finally did emerge under Crassus, a privately raised army. He managed to defeat Spartacus, but a lot of the credit ended up going to Pompey, who at this time was the most popular Roman, because he managed to mop up a few survivors. And then, interestingly enough, while there were no further slave revolts, the overall impact of the Third Servile War would still destabilize Roman politics by setting up a bitter rivalry between Pompey and Crassus, which would really contribute to political gridlock throughout the 60s, and ultimately help contribute to the First Triumvirate, which of course contributes to Caesar rising to power, and the end of the Republic. So, getting things right is important, and the Romans weren't too concerned about solving problems, at least not as concerned as they should have been. Their attitude in the late Republic was very much that they should sweep things under the rug and hope that things got better. And that attitude proved fatal. The Romans were not able to come up with adequate reforms which stabilized their political system, and when there were gaps in the social order, such as the fact that they were vulnerable to mass-scale slave revolts, they were very slow to figure out ways to deal with that. So, just keep that in mind when we talk about the larger political turmoil that the Roman Republic faced. The Romans were apparently unwilling or unable to fix their own problems, so in many ways, their ultimate downfall was their own fault. This is exactly what happens when you refuse to deal with problems that you know exist, but just keep ignoring.